I've always been looking at Dansby Swanson's situation with an eye on Tim Anderson.
Mhm.
And my crazy idea after Swanson has signed that if you want the White Sox to not be so embarrassed that they
Mhm.
have signed Andrew Benintendi to a franchise record setting contract of 7 years, $75 million. My crazy idea is that the Chicago White Sox extend Tim Anderson now.
Ugh. It is tough just because the games played are going the wrong way. Like, had he had a season like in the last 4 where he played like 140 games, 150 games, like he's played 123, 49 out of 60, 123 and 79 last 4 years. And then he's going to be age 30. Like could be a case where extending him now when he might have peaked already is really that's what stops me. Like I get the argument for it. I like the idea of exploring it, seeing what he would sign for. But I could see a case where, like, just thinking about the James McCann, 2 years he was on the White Sox, and then like he, moved on to the Mets, and he was a popular player with the White Sox, and some people preferred him to Yasmani Grandal, and there were discussions, White Sox Twitter and elsewhere, just trying to figure out, like, is there a way to keep him? Is there a way to trade Grandal? What do you have to sign McCann for? And then McCann signed for 4 and 40 for with the Mets, and that kind of just eliminated the conversation. Like, oh, okay, that's unfeasible. And then he's been a disaster for the Mets, and there's been some discussion about whether McCann could come back to the White Sox, given where he had success. But to me, it's just like it's like a perfectly golden 2 years. Like nobody can speak badly about the guy. Like why ruin that? Like that was a special time they had together, and there's no reason to go back to that well when just it might be might tarnish the times he had. Think about like Robin Ventura in the White Sox coming back as a manager. I kind of have the same feeling here right now, just with the way he struggled to stay healthy, and the bat's good, but the walk to strikeout rate, divide is still massive. And to me, I just see like a guy who, just might lose more of his legs faster than other people. Like, Trey Turner has been fast and healthy. Tim Anderson has been fast, but not healthy. So, will the legs crap out on him faster than Turner's legs are projected to? That's one question I have. And then the other one is just like, will he be, will that walk to strikeout chasm, will that will he eventually just lose the ability to hit past that? And if so, like, what does he have? So to me, it's just like the drop off, the risk of just offering very little, like 1 to 2 wins a season, just because whether he's unavailable or whether the way his game comes together is so fragile for aging, scares me a little bit for signing him to an extension.
Yeah, I don't have those fears. I wouldn't even compare him to the whole James McCann situation. James McCann was a scratch off lottery ticket that won you $50 for the White Sox.
Hmm.
We didn't like that signing at the beginning, Jim, because James McCann was terrible for Detroit. And then he found his stroke to right center field, and it worked great at guarantee rate field. And yeah, he cashed
Yeah.
in. So congrats to James McCann. But the difference here for Tim Anderson is that this is one of the few White Sox players that they have drafted and they have developed into an all-star. And if you have signed Andrew Benintendi to a 5-year contract, and I know I mentioned this in the live show, but this is worthwhile now.
Hmm.
And there must be some conversation that's changing at 35th and Shields. Because if you are truly looking at this being the last ride, and you are given an opportunity in 2024 to shed some serious payroll, maybe go through a bit of a transition here, have a reload type of year, even more significant payroll comes off, and then your younger players should be ready to get through Birmingham and be ready to contribute in the major leagues. So you'll have some cheap solutions at premium spots, but then you'll have a lot more payroll to be freed up, so you could be even more interesting in free agency. But you signed Benintendi to a 5-year contract, so that makes me think you're not looking at going through another rebuild anytime soon. And if you're not going to be doing that, then who are going to be some of these players that are going to be on the roster beyond the 2025 season? Because Andrew Vaughn starts his arbitration in 2024. And again, you're going to have Eloy Jimenez and Yohan Moncada's contract entering those club option years, and they're not going to be around much longer with the Chicago White Sox. And as we've seen in the free agent market, they don't have the appetite to spend the type of money and the type of years to keep Lucas Giolito around and Dylan Cease and Michael Kopech. This conversation gets sour pretty quick. But with Tim Anderson, now that the market has been set, I think
Mhm.
I'm going to be looking at this more positively. I get your fears about, well, I'm worried that he can't carry a full workload. Out of the entire roster of the Chicago White Sox, even if Tim Anderson plays 130 games, he's one of the few guys that's a 3 WAR, 4 WAR type of player on your team. And the way that shortstops are getting paid, if you would like to keep someone like Tim Anderson around, even if you are maybe thinking about a position change for him when he's in his mid to late 30s, it's going to cost. It's going to cost a lot of money. So my idea here, as far as the extension for Tim Anderson, what I'm thinking to get him to sign, because that is the goal here. I
Mhm.
like Tim Anderson more than Dansby Swanson. And yeah, Dansby Swanson's 2 years younger than Tim Anderson, and Swanson has had some clutch moments in the postseason for the Atlanta Braves in the last few years. But overall, the body of work in the last 5 years, Tim Anderson has been better than Dansby Swanson. So my idea of a contract extension would be 7 years, $180 million. You can keep Tim Anderson in a White Sox uniform pretty much for his entire career. He can finally be the face of the Chicago White Sox with Jose Abreu leaving. I would make it a $5 million signing bonus, which would put his AAV at $25 million per season, playing the luxury tax game. And then you got Tim Anderson through the 2030 season, and he's part of the roster and moving forward for the White Sox. And you can eliminate as far as that question. I know you are listening, podcast listeners, and those watching on YouTube. What about Colson Montgomery? Ever since Colson Montgomery has been drafted, there have been many that suggested that as he went through his development, because of his size being 6'4", and he doesn't have the same athleticism and range as someone like Tim Anderson, if Montgomery wanted to get to the majors the quickest, third base is the most likely position that he will land. I have thought that Montgomery can stick at shortstop if given the opportunity, but with my idea here, I say it's worthwhile for the White Sox to lock up the player that you drafted and developed, reset your franchise record for biggest contract ever signed. And if you want to show a serious sign to other agents and players out there that will be impending free agents who keep thinking, well, the Chicago White Sox are never going to offer serious money, this is serious money. And you would be locking up one of the best players on the team. And if you want to regain trust from the fan base, I can't think of a better way of keeping Tim Anderson for the long term.
So let me look at Anderson real quick. Like with that contract, does that contract start in 25?
So this contract would wipe out. My idea would be wiping out his club option next year. So instead of the 14.5 million, just pay him $25 million. And again, this would entice him to sign because he
Yeah.
could say no, right? If you talk to him right now, maybe his thinking is, I'm going to crush the next 2 years, and then I'm going to enter free agency. And people will say, well, then you'll be 32 years old. Well, Marcus Semien was 31 years old and signed a 7-year, $175 million contract with the Texas Rangers. So if Anderson's an all-star shortstop the next 2 years, yeah, he may not get a 7-year contract, but he's going to probably be worth more than $25 million a season.
Okay. Because couple of things with the Swanson comparison. Swanson will be 29 next year. Anderson, the year he begins, that extension will be 31. So there's that. The other thing with Swanson is last 3 years, 60 games out of 60, then 160 and 162. So I think
Yes,
that's
he does play every day.
yeah. So I think that's really, when it comes to, which one is worth more than the other. I think Anderson is the better player, but I think availability is a part of the package, especially like up the middle when you're talking about like a key defensive performance and how that affects like the way your team coalesces, around your pitching staff, I think is a big part of it. So that's why, like, I'm not as enthusiastic. And the McCann thing wasn't like for the McCann type player, but just more along the lines like, they didn't ask too much. It was like a nice golden career. Like where it ended was the perfect place to end. And with Anderson, like I'm just wondering, like, is after age 31, will that be like the right time for it to end? Like, there may be a better comparison in terms of just like similar staying with the White Sox was Alexi Ramirez, who basically like he had that sign that extension and carried him through age 33. And like he tailed off his last year. But otherwise, like it was just a nice little White Sox career he had, like perfectly timed. And then like he was done after 34. But he played every day too. Like he was always good for 150 games plus every year. So that's kind of what it comes down to. Is just like, I think the difference between the Benintendi and the Anderson one, when it comes to like the deals and like representing records, is I think the White Sox were willing to set their record or nudge the bar ever so slightly higher, because I don't think Benintendi runs the risk of being an albatross or like something who just like completely weighs down the books. I think he's going to be okay. And I think, most teams will look at like an okay outfielder and say like, he's worth 15 million. They really won't think about it too much. They won't want him on their books necessarily, but just, you kind of shrug at it and say like, oh, he's there, he's there till age 33 or age 32. I think it covers 28 through 32. A team might want to trade for it later, just feeling like they could, he could plug a hole in as a platoon bat. Like, I don't think the White Sox are going to feel saddled down by that as they would for like 180. I think that's kind of what my theory has always been. Like the White Sox, Rick Hahn doesn't count on going anywhere. The White Sox ownership doesn't count on Rick Hahn going anywhere. And Rick Hahn doesn't want to sign a contract he has to deal with later. And so I think he's fine with Jerry Reinsdorf's crackdown on contracts because he doesn't have to work harder later. And I think Anderson at that deal, especially if it starts at age 31, would be one that they would have to try to work out from under later. So that's why I think makes it slightly different from Benintendi. Like I would be happy for Anderson. I think a lot of White Sox fans would be happy. I would hope it would work out. Like I can see the upside. I could see the benefit, but just the games played and the struggle to play games before age 30 makes me feel a little bit itchy about his ability to play games after age 30.
You have no money on the books. Like this contract would not bog down the White Sox because they don't have any money on the books in 2024, in 2025, and in 2026. Like it would just be pretty much Tim Anderson.
Yeah, but that was the argument for Manny Machado too. And Manny Machado was not one of their own. I think that's the difference here. And it was also, well, they were willing to pay 280 instead of 180. But yeah, it's just, I just have a feeling the way I think they operate is just like, if Rick Hahn were somebody who had a risk of being fired, they might say, oh, go for it. If it doesn't work out, the next GM will have to clean it up, the Dombrowski method. And the White Sox just don't do things that way. So I think that's why in this case, I feel like they would view it as a risk of blowing up on him the way like Benintendi doesn't seem like it's going to blow up on him. Like you same thing like Liam Hendricks, they signed that deal because like if he gets hurt or if it just doesn't work out, it's 14 million to 15 million, or you pay him 1.5. Like just they can shrug it away in due time. I think Anderson crossed the threshold of being able to shrug it away, which a big market team would take that occasional risk. But if I'm speaking as like what I expect the White Sox, how I think they would look at it, I want to see them. I guess they're going to have to prove me wrong at some point when it comes to spending that kind of money. But I think that's what might scare them away, just because that is just a lot of games missed.
Well, there's a lot of things that scare the White Sox away from spending any type of money. The thing about this idea of extending Tim Anderson is if you don't do it now, I guess you get another opportunity next year. But from Tim Anderson's point of view, he's making $12.5 million this season. His club option next season is $14.5 million. All right, good job, White Sox. This is a contract extension that's working out really well for you, because if Tim Anderson bounces back and if he plays 140 plus games and he goes back to being a 4-WAR shortstop, Jim, they are getting great value out of those club options from Tim Anderson. But if you have any desire of keeping Tim Anderson in a White Sox uniform for the long term. And as we have seen in the shortstop class and the free agency class the last couple of years, premium shortstops go for $25 million a season. And they're looking at more than 6 year contracts with Javier Baez, Trevor Story. Doesn't matter what you think of them. Dansby Swanson now, these guys, Tim Anderson probably fits into this group more than Trey Turner, Xander Bogaerts, and of course, Carlos Correa. He's not going to be cheap. If you want to keep Tim Anderson in a White Sox uniform for the long term, I think it's worthwhile having the conversation now. The market is set. There's not too much you can do about this season because you already picked up the club option. But with the $5 million signing bonus, you can give them a little extra cash for this season. And it's not going to be impacting your luxury tax that much at all. And then next year he gets a raise, and he's being paid as one of the premium shortstops in Major League Baseball. And I know that he can still be a top 10 shortstop and he'd be paid like a top 10 shortstop, and they could help at least as far as with the roster makeup long term for the White Sox. Because if you don't do this, and then after next season, it's Andrew Benintendi and the players entering the ARB years, and the future is still pretty cloudy. So that's why I think it's worthwhile to have this conversation. Will the White Sox have this conversation is a whole different topic in itself. Probably not. Their spending tendencies will just take advantage of the fact that this is a contract extension that's working out, and that balances out the contract extension with Yohan Makata. That's not really working out, where they're paying him $17.5 million this year, and they have to pay him $24 million next season. Tim Anderson probably helps out balance the scales there, at least in the payroll.
Andrew, yeah, I was just thinking Andrew Benintendi spending tendencies is a good tongue twister. Um, I guess to close it up, I think like Andrew Benintendi signing for 5 years, I think is a positive sign because we haven't seen the White Sox do a 5 year deal in a while for like a free agent of any kind, like Jose Abreu signed for 6. But really, on either side of the ball, the White Sox really don't like going beyond 4 years for a player who isn't their own. So good for them in that regard. So hopefully they're willing to wade deeper into that pool. I doubt it, but that just that's something I noticed.